Hello everyone, welcome back to Alkaline Hydroxide 784. Today in the GP overview series, we'll be looking at the second subject in our theme, which is geography. As usual, I keep having trouble putting these videos up on time. Oh well. Anyways, the thing is, I only studied geography until secondary 2, so I'm obviously not gonna be that spontaneous with the arguments as compared to history. But I think I did come up with a good list of arguments which I think you all wanna hear. So let's get started. So first off, let's just quickly clear what we usually think of when we talk about geography. As I think most of us would know this, but geography is usually classified into two different, sets. One which is physical geography, and the other which is human geography. So physical geography, well, the thing that I remember the most from physical geography is how a horseshoe lake is formed. But okay, that's funny. Okay. Anyways, about how the physical environment works, like how horseshoe lakes are formed, for example, and how the tectonic plates and everything all move, and how rivers and other features are formed and things like that. So that's what physical geography is about. On the other hand, we have human geography, which I think is sometimes more interesting to people because it actually involves people. And it's about how people interact with themselves as well as with the environment. So, you know, it can include stuff like how the population density and other um, statistics of the population changes with regards to the geography, or how certain geographical features or certain things that characteristics actually affect how the humans behave, or vice versa, how the human behavior actually affects the actual physical environment. Okay, so we'll be going through a few different topics, I suppose, and some of them are more physical geography, some of them are more human geography. So I'm not going to try to classify them. I'll just maybe briefly say what I think it is, but you can decide that for yourself. And basically, we'll be looking at what are the uses of geography in today, as far as I can remember. And yeah, I mean, it's the list is probably not exhaustive, but if I actually tried to come up with a super comprehensive list, it would take forever, and I don't want to take forever. So let's just start, okay? Yeah. So the first topic is about truly true to the core physical geography, and that is about understanding geological processes and geographical features. Quick note, geology is one of the branches of geography, but it also has its own name, so you can refer to geology if you need to. Yeah. So in this topic, the first point that we'll be talking about is the weather. I think this is pretty obvious though, because it's like, the weather. And of course, as we found out last time, the weather can be predicted based on what we see before that particular day. But apart from that, we also use the actual features and the actual characteristics of a location to determine the average temperature or the predictability, like what kind of weather you can predict from that particular location. So, for example, you can maybe say, maybe if there's mountains or certain, big structures there, then you can see how the presence of such geographical features actually affect the weather. To be honest, I'm not so familiar with the exact explanation, but I think mountains usually affect the movement of wind because, they're like big structures amongst a flat surface. And I think mountains most likely affect water. It's basically how the water moves through the water cycle, in the sense, because they have like the rivers, and they have like ice caps which become the rivers, or even glaciers that become rivers. And this water also contributes to rain, which in turn recycles back up to the mountain again. So yeah, well, mountains kind of affect that part of the weather, I believe. And apart from mountains, you can talk about how rainforests or just normal vegetation affects the climate, Or you can even talk about why deserts are so hot in the day and so cold at night, which apparently is due to their low humidity. And what that means is the air isn't very good at holding in the heat. It has a pretty low how do I put it? It's a basically not a very good yeah, it not a very good insulator, I suppose, or yeah, it just releases the heat very easily and it doesn't keep it in. It doesn't have enough water to help keep the heat in place. I think it could probably liken it to how water has a high, like, what's that thing called? Uh, yeah, heat density or something. Basically, okay, never mind. I don't want to accidentally say something wrong, but you get the point. The fact that there's not a lot of water makes it harder for the atmosphere to retain heat, and therefore it becomes cold very quickly, and also it becomes hot very quickly because the day is just sun. It doesn't reflect enough heat back up. And yeah, the fact that there's low humidity is actually part of the definition for deserts because they don't have a lot of precipitation. That's the main definition. And if they don't have a lot of precipitation, it's usually because they have low humidity. And that's why Antarctica is also considered a desert, even though it's very cold. Okay, anyway, that's not important. So apart from that, you can also talk about how the presence of human-built structures, which is a bit more human geography already, can talk about how the things that we build, like big buildings, actually cause the temperature of a city to be warmer compared to if there were no such big buildings. And this effect can be probably termed as, the heat sink. Like the city is literally a heat. It just attracts all the heat inside. And this because I believe the buildings tend to reflect the heat within the city, and also they are not exactly green in color. They're not exactly plants, so they don't they don't really take in any of the heat. They allow the heat to just be there, linger in the city, and so the city tends to be hotter. But I think you should probably look at the links for a better explanation of this, because I don't remember the exact explanation that was used. So that's the first point in this first topic. So the second point in the topic is about energy and extraction. Right. So when it comes to energy and you think about geology or geography, the first thing that comes to you is comes to your mind is geothermal energy, or at least it comes to my mind very quickly. The idea of geothermal, because it involves knowing how the geological or geographical processes work, like tectonic plates and how the magma kind of heats up you know, um, the crust, basically, the Earth's crust, or just below the Earth's crust, the mantle. And yeah, we kind of covered this in our energy sources episode, so I won't go into the details of how geothermal energy works. But in general, the idea of knowing the geography of a location is to help you see if it's worthwhile doing it in the first place, because some places aren't very suitable for geothermal. It's usually the volcanic regions or like the ring of fire kind of area which is suitable for geothermal energy. And also you need to know that, because if you just drill the wrong place, you're just wasting your money. Yeah, that's the point. So apart from geothermal, you can also look at very conventional energy sources like oil. So, you need to know where to install your oil rig and extract the oil, because if you find a good spot, you can just stay there for ages and keep extracting oil and, getting that money. Yeah, the dollar bills just raining on them. And that's why some of them actually just go into the sea and install their rig there, because that's where a lot of oil reserves tend to be found sometimes. And apart from oil, maybe another place where they need to search for the right location is fracking. Fracking is where they kind of make some cracks, and they try to it involves natural gas, so they're trying to get that to happen by heating up the area and introducing small cracks to easily extract the gas. So I believe it fracking uses similar locations as geothermal sources in a sense. And even for things like solar power and wind power, you need a good location to install the solar panels and the wind turbines. I believe we have covered that a bit in the energy resources episode. Basically, for solar panels, you need a sunny place in which there's not a lot of things covering it and creating a big shadow. And for wind, you also need a huge location which is not like frequented by many animals or any other living beings, because you don't want them to get killed by the wind turbine. Yeah. And in fact, you could probably apply this to literally anything. And apart from energy sources, you can also apply this logic to extraction. So if you extract something, you need to find the right composition of soil or earth to, to determine whether you can find a large enough concentration of those elements or minerals that you need. So, for example, rare earths, because rare earths are not necessarily rare, but like they are extracted in such a way that it is more profitable to find a location in which you actually can get a lot of rare earths. And even then, when you extract, you usually extract maybe 5 times or 10 times the volume of stuff or the mass of stuff in order to get the actual element that you're looking for, like lithium or all the other stuff that they use in mobile phones and batteries and things like that. So I think lithium is one of the major ones, but I believe stuff like what else? I mean, I'm not sure they use neodymium is more of a magnet thing. I think it's used in magnets because neodymium magnets are quite good, like they're quite strong. Um, and yeah, a bunch of other elements. If I remember them, I'll write it there. But if I don't remember to write it, then oops. Anyways, that's the point lah. So you understanding how the soil composition and how the surrounding environment is, like what's the characteristics of the surrounding environment, will help you decide what is worthwhile extracting or what is worthwhile doing in that location. And yeah, so the third point is science. And for science, well, you can use geography to look at what is considered a unique ecosystem. Like if you look at very extreme locations, because the normal location that you're used to has a certain temperature range, a certain humidity, a certain pressure, a certain elevation, a certain everything. But there are some locations in which you do not really expect life to be seen, especially in places like volcanoes or in other such places. I mean, all the places in which major discoveries were made is actually the bottom of the sea, like at least 200 meters or even 3 kilometers below sea level. And there we have geothermal vents and also many other unusual fish species and other kinds of living beings that are there so far down in the sea, because the pressure there is really great, and you don't usually expect a lot of life forms to be there, but there is surprisingly a lot of life down there. But even that is not the most extreme of places. There's even more, like there are places like inside volcanoes itself, or even other super extreme locations in which you can find life. And the main benefit of looking at all of this research is to help us as well, because we can find out more about the diversity of life forms in Earth, which may give us more hope of finding such life in outer space. And also we can get some significance through the evolution. Maybe some of these organisms are like super ancient, and we can then find out our true origins or something. And also we can look at the medical or chemical use, because um, there are some really old ancient creatures that could help us in a medical sense, or they could help us in a different form of like a chemical sense, maybe bacteria that can eat plastic or something like that, basically. And yeah, that's basically the benefit of looking at different geographical features and finding out more about all of these new living organisms. And of course, you don't have to. I mean, you can talk about the existing ecosystems as well because that's also part of geography. And you can talk about how the like climate change or certain geographical features actually influence the ecosystems that live there. But I think that one is something that you already know about. So I think it's more interesting to mention this part of it. Like you can use geography to find about even newer or like different living beings and talk about it. But if you want to talk about ecology, you can as well. Yeah. So the fourth point is archaeology or history. So this is slightly different. This is about the history of things, like how things evolved or how what actually lived many years ago. So first thing that you'll be talking about is the fossil record, of course, because certain fossils are preserved in the ground and certain things are not so preserved, so it depends on like what the composition of that object in the sense like for example a bone is mostly like calcium and like calcium phosphate, and technically it's a mineral kind of thing, so it easily gets mineralized and fossilized in a sense, versus something that is more organic, like like your skin or like the organs and things like that. They tend to decompose very easily, so you don't usually see them in the fossil record. And they need, of course, the people who are studying these fossils need to know these limitations so that they can still try their best to find what can be found, but at the same time acknowledge that you cannot find everything that can be found. And when they do manage to find something that you usually cannot get fossilized, it's a big discovery because it's usually due to certain exceptional circumstances. Maybe it was frozen in ice, or maybe something else happened and it somehow got fossilized, and then it becomes really useful in a sense. So apart from the fossils, you also need to know when these fossils came from. So for that, you need to look at how deep it was, in which layer of rock the fossil was found, because over time the rocks form layers in the soil, and the composition of rocks will kind of indicate what's the history of that particular land, because over time earth has faced many different temperature variations, many different volcanic events which would introduce more volcanic rock, or certain other tectonic events, or anything else that could potentially change the composition of the rock layers over time. So they use the layers of rock. There's other ways to date a particular object, and by date I do not mean going on a relationship with someone. No, it's literally assigning a date to an object. So methods like carbon dating and using the layers of rocks, basically the stratum, I guess the stratum, and also other methods like the radioisotopes. Wait, is it radioisotopes? Yeah, basically nuclear fission. Use that to figure out the date of an object and things like that. And by using these methods, you can also find out when certain groups of people lived, because apart from fossils, you can find out things like pottery and certain written records of stuff written on a stone tablet, a stone tab. Why am I saying it with two S's? Oh my gosh, a tablet basically, and they usually put it on the clay tablet and do some etches and kind of write in the ancient language, and you can find out more about the civilizations of the past using these tablets, as well as the time frame that they came from. And apart from stuff like fossils and pottery and stuff, another place where you can find out about the history is, of course, ice cores. And I've already talked about it in a previous episode, basically the history episode on history. And ice cores can be used to study the climate, to see how the concentrations of oxygen and other gas molecules change over time, and also study the climate in the past without having to actually go back in time to find out what happened then. Yeah. And speaking of ice cores, we can talk about the last point for this particular topic, which is climate changes effects. So yeah, we can study the changes in soil composition and ice cores and everything to find out, what happened in the past or what is going to happen soon in terms of the climate. And we can also look at today's real-time changes in terms of the coastal change. If the sea level is rising, there will be lesser coast, basically. I mean, not the length of coast, but more of like lesser land that is above the water, or like the change in the coastal line itself, maybe. And maybe if you're looking at temperatures itself, temperature increasing over the years or decreasing in certain places unexpectedly or increasing in other places, it is also climate change. Or it could be stuff like natural disasters happening more often, like the tsunamis and earthquakes. You know, these events are actually becoming more prevalent. And other such, measurements of climate can be used to study the effects of climate change and also see what are the best ways to mitigate it or what are the best ways to counteract the changes that came about, yeah, via climate. And yeah, that's the last point for the first topic. And we move on to the second topic, and it's already 20 minutes. Oh my gosh. Right, so the second topic is maths. And yeah, at least maps has lesser stuff to talk about. So by maps, I mean cartography. I believe that's the actual terminology for it. And I would, assign it something like physical geography as seen in the eyes of humans. So it's actually both physical and human geography because maps are pretty much a human invention, and the way that they are drafted is very human in a sense. So the first point in maps is the difficulties of maps. How basically I summarized it in the question of how to make a sphere into a rectangle. It is similar to the question of trying to make the circle into a square or something like that, but in this case we're looking at how to make the surface area of the sphere into a rectangle. And as you can tell, that is very hard because the earth is not a rectangle. It is not flat. It is a rounded object. And if you wanted to make it into a rectangle without distorting the things, that would be extremely hard. You would end up just cutting through the sphere in a certain way. And if you think about the globe, it has the latitude and the longitude lines, right? So if you cut across some of the lines, maybe you can spread it out onto a flat surface, but it will definitely not look like a rectangle. So in reality, when cartographers make maps, the places that are nearer to the North Pole or the South Pole tend to be more elongated than they actually are. So it makes certain places like Greenland look extremely huge when they are actually aren't that huge. And that's why there's a website to see the actual size of certain countries with respect to other countries. So the better way of looking at the map is actually a globe because the globe is, somewhat more accurate in terms of the geometry of the earth. And yeah, anyways, so the point is it's hard to make a map, but that's not the only problem. There's even more issues than the simplistic take of just trying to convert a sphere into a rectangle. And these issues tend to be more human in nature, and that would be one, basically the borders. Sometimes borders are hard to make, and also putting the names of all the locations and everything, it's very, very troublesome. And yeah, things like that can be very problematic because borders themselves can be quite contentious sometimes. And when you don't really know what to put a name to it, like what kind of name to put to that particular location, to the right and left of a line, you don't really know what to do after that. And you're just like, oh no. And sometimes people don't really know all of the information that they need to know. Like maybe there's certain pieces of data that they do not know about the world. So in the past, maybe, let's say if you haven't exactly explored the entire world, you don't even know that maybe somewhere like New Zealand actually exists, then you may not even draw it in the map, for example. Or if you don't really know much about Antarctica or the Arctic, then you may not know how to draw that place. You may just draw like a blob and then call it Antarctica or something. So, map making is hard. Luckily, we have technology, right? I mean, how else is Google Maps a thing? So Google Maps, The only reason why it is so used by so many people is because it has technology on its side. Google has like a lot of satellites to take pictures. I mean, not just satellites, they even have actual people to go to some of the locations and take pictures of the location. So, they really are trying their best to get a really comprehensive map. And they even have a globe version of it, which is that Google Earth. Basically, you can swivel the Earth around and look at it in its real form, in a sense. But even Google Maps faces problems, and these problems are definitely very human in the nature rather than the physical location itself. So, for example, in China, it's not allowed to accurately show the locations of certain businesses and things like that because China does not want Google to, put the actual accurate map of China. It in fact doesn't allow anyone to put an accurate map of China. I believe even like Chinese map makers are not really allowed to do it. I think that's what the video said. I watched one video on it. But the point is, the Google Maps in China isn't that accurate. It is semi-accurate, but not super accurate. So you might want to be a bit careful when you go there next time and use Google Maps. Don't accidentally get lost. Okay. But apart from China, in other locations, sometimes Google doesn't know the name of a location. And it just allocates it some random name that it managed to find in some random website. So, Google Maps is also having trouble. And what's worse, there's disputed locations, and Google Maps doesn't know what to do with them disputed locations. And if it depicts the borders in a certain way that can make countries angry, that will not end well in a sense. So yeah, Google Maps has a hard challenge to face and is somehow doing it. Anyways, so the second point under maps is time zones. Yeah, time zones are very interesting because by right, if you were to segregate the time zones into nice 12-hour, 12 segments, it should be nice and straight, right? But in reality, when you look at a map, even if you look at Google Maps, you can see the time zone. And some of the time zones look like, I don't know what they look like. They just look like some little kid literally just scribbled the line instead of actually drawing the line. And there are reasons for that. And those reasons are very human in nature too. Basically, people felt it's more convenient to just assign a time zone to a much larger location than it was supposed to be. And that can actually cause problems. I mean, for example, if we can technically like go to China and the time doesn't change all that much, there's something wrong. I'm pretty sure China seems to share like a really huge location, like huge land area for the same time zone. And I feel bad for the people who live on the part of the land in which is not really matching to the time zone. But it's not even just like big countries like China or even India maybe or America who have like time zone issues. It's also small places like us. In fact, Singapore's time zone is not really correct. Its time zone is shared with Malaysia, then I don't know. Yeah, it shares its time zone with Malaysia and Hong Kong, I believe. And there is a problem with that, and that time zone is about 1 hour off. So in reality, Singapore is basically in permanent daylight savings time, basically. That's the best way to describe it. The US has this thing where they set their clocks a bit earlier or something to get some daylight. Yeah, basically Singapore is the epitome of it all year round. Yeah, because our time zone is 1 hour off the actual time. Oh well. You can find out more about it online or in the link that I put down in the website. Okay. So that's the second topic. So the third topic is the organization of human society. So we are truly getting into human geography here because this is about humans. So the first point in this is city planning. So what determines city planning? Well, I mean, apart from deciding to put all your roads straight in one direction because it's easier to navigate, there's also other things that affect how you plan your city. Because if, let's say, you have a certain climate, certain elevation, certain ground surface, and also the prevalence of natural disasters, All of these things can affect how you plan your city or build your buildings. For example, if you look at Japan, they have managed to build many buildings that can actually resist earthquakes. And this makes sense because they experience a lot of earthquakes. And they experience earthquakes like every year. And for them, their earthquakes are quite deadly sometimes. So it's important for them to actually build earthquake resistant buildings compared to, let's say, here in Singapore, even if we get an earthquake, it's a pretty residual kind of earthquake. And that's about as much of the natural disasters we ever seem to get. And I think that's a good thing. We are kind of protected by all the other countries around us. And for us, maybe instead of earthquakes, we have to be worried about rising sea levels instead, because we are an island, and if the sea level rises too much in the next few decades, it will be completely submerged. So for us, what is more important? Maybe building things around the road, making the roads higher near the coastal areas, and also building stuff to prevent the sea from coming in and submerging the land in some parts of the coast. And other low-lying countries also have, like, built things to help prevent the sea from coming and submerging them further. And if you want a more, cliche example, you can look at the Eskimos, and they build igloos because they live in a cold place and they need, they have ice. Ice is around them, so they use it as their building material. And if they build it, kind of helps them to actually trap heat inside the igloo, and it works for them because that's just how it is. So the igloo structure helps them to stay warm and still make use of the ice around them as a building material, because the ice doesn't melt as well. It stays there nicely in that particular structure. And likewise, in deserts, there are certain structures that you can, in theory, build in order to make your desert life a bit easier. Usually, it'll be using clay to build your house in order to make it cooler and things like that. So there's a lot of like things that you can do to live in different climates, and that's how humans have managed to live in so many different parts of the world. Even though we aren't exactly extremophiles, we still have lived in many different climates, which is pretty amazing to say the least. Right. So that's one thing. I mean, it's not really just about city planning, but more of just in general building planning. If you want to look at more of city planning itself, you can look at where the city is located. As you can see, generally the population density tends to be higher in easier to live locations which are nearer to resources. So, for example, the coastal areas are always quite densely populated to some extent, although not too close to the coast, but near the coast somewhat, because there's a lot of water, there's a lot of resources, and it's generally not next to a big mountain. So you're near sea level as well. Whereas if you look at mountains, there aren't that many people living in the mountains itself, so the population density there tends to be a bit lower. And also the mountains are kind of cold and a bit harder to live in compared to the lower lands of the same country in a sense. And that's why we tend to see the fact that cities are very densely populated, and then as you move out from the cities, it becomes very not super dense afterwards. So yeah, that's basically how humans work. Right. So the second point is, well, another way of people congregating is in terms of racial enclaves or segregation by certain groups. So how geography or certain human interactions influence this and vice versa. So I think the most like logical way to look at it is that people tend to congregate with others who are like them. So that is one thing that I can say. I think anyone would probably put out that theory. Even in school, if you know someone, you're more likely to be with them compared to someone who you're not so familiar with. So like attracts like. That's the first thing I can say about it. And the second thing I can say is in a opposite sense, like as the populations stay in different locations for years, they then become more and more divergent from each other. So there's two different ways of looking at it. Either you can see that people congregate with others who are like them, or people who happen to be congregated in different locations end up becoming more different from each other. Yeah, so for example, if you look at the mountains, people who live there are able to survive at a lower oxygen concentration because their blood can absorb more oxygen compared to people who don't live in the mountains. And another obvious thing that changes between different populations is the language as well as the culture of different populations. And this can actually lead to conflicts later on if, let's say, one group tries to conquer another group's area. This can become a problem because they have differences to begin with. If, let's say, they're super similar, then maybe there won't even be a real conflict and they just like assimilate and I don't know, you all become one country or something. I don't know. But yeah, the fact is because people end up getting separated, they become different in some way, and that can create some issues later on if they cannot get along well with each other. And if you're looking at a smaller scale, like how Singapore has got like Little India and Chinatown and Kampong Glam and all that, well, that's because of colonialism, external authorities in the sense. And this can be true for many of the places, many of the borders and the weirdness that's going on today is due to colonialism. That's why, there are some conflicts that even arise, which we'll look at we'll look at some examples soon in a sense. And apart from colonialism and external authorities, this could also be due to certain representative enclaves, which is like the light attract light issue, like that kind of the phenomenon of light attracts light. And that would probably explain why there are many countries in which there's a Chinatown or similar locations for other ethnic groups or racial groups. I'm not sure what would be the better term to use here, but you get the point. So there are certain locations in which a certain group tends to live in a quite they're like quite densely populating one small location as compared to the other locations in that country. And apart from that, we can talk about stuff like apartheid and conflicts and stuff like that. But I think we'll talk about conflicts later on. Basically, what I mean here is because of the differences in groups and the fact that people tend to congregate in certain locations, this is what causes issues because as people identify themselves with their group and the location that they're at, they then don't really want anyone else challenging their identity or challenging their authority over that certain land or their culture or anything else that they identify with. And that leads to conflicts and also leads to certain groups discriminating against others and many other issues that we face today as well. Right. So the third point within human society is of course population statistics. This is very geography, as I remember, in terms of human geography. This is one of the things that we look at. And the most famous thing that we look at is the population pyramid because it can tell us a lot about the society. You can see how many young people there are, how many old people there are in that particular society. So, like for example, if you look at Singapore's one, basically its older segment is growing bigger and bigger over time because our population, our birth statistics aren't that high. So, yeah, and Japan is just as bad. So, yeah, that can help us explain certain phenomenon that we are seeing today, like maybe more services and goods that are targeted towards the older population, or certain initiatives by the government to try to improve the birth, the birth in the sense birth statistics, the birth rate. I mean, yeah, birth rate and things like that. So it helps us understand certain things. And apart from population pyramid, you can also look at population density or overpopulation because in certain countries there's a lot of young people and there's a very high birth rate. And sometimes, as I mentioned earlier, people like to congregate in the city rather than in the other locations. And since the city is a location which attracts more and more people to come there, it leads to overpopulation over time, and it feels very crowded in the city sometimes. And it's not because there's not enough land, but because a lot of people chose to stay in that small piece of land. That's the real reason behind it. So yeah, there are many pull factors that bring people in from the rural areas or like the less densely populated areas into the super dense areas. So it's like It's like a magnet is just attracting more and more iron fillings into towards itself rather than away from it in a sense. And yeah, the population density also affects how things like food and resources are distributed. And you can also explain these things using the climate and the geography of an area. Because if we look at, for example, Singapore, we don't have a lot of resources. We have to import everything from many different locations. And even our water, we have had like an agreement with Johor Bahru to get water from their lake. But we are becoming more self-sufficient using seawater desalination as well as new water. So I guess, we understand that we have a lack of resources and we need to make the most of what we have. Right. So the last point under this topic is the humanitarian crisis caused by scarce resources. I mean, okay, like I literally just wrote one huge sentence here. Basically, it's about humanitarian crisis, a crisis, yeah, like crisis, and this can be caused due to scarce resources, can be caused due to certain climate problems like floods or droughts or issues that are caused by over farming or by certain industrial processes or even things like La Nina, El Nino, changing the weather and doing some weird rain patterns everywhere, and so on and so forth. So the thing that we can probably talk about in terms of crises like this is how certain climates or geographical locations are more prone to disasters. For example, Japan more prone to earthquakes, Ring of Fire more prone to volcanoes and earthquakes and things like that. And how climate change makes things worse. Well, as the humans, we humans have made the climate worse over the years. There's more natural disasters. It also changes what we are usually accustomed to because there are definitely locations with very unusual high temperatures, like maybe in the desert area and all that kind of location, and people are used to that. They manage to adapt to whatever existing highs or lows that they face in that location. But with climate change, it would make it even worse, and they may not be sufficiently adapted to that even greater change, and that would cause problems for the people living in the society and yeah, stuff like that. It's not just about temperature; it can also be about the presence of water, like how much water you get due to rainfall changes, or how much like how your farming is affected due to the rainfall as well. So yeah, you can talk. So that's how geography can help us understand these things as well. I'm not gonna explain because it's getting quite late, and I also don't know how to explain it. So let's move on. So the fourth topic is why conflicts arise. Yes. Once again, this is very human geography. So the first point is, of course, due to resources. I've already mentioned that resources are quite a thing that affects many stuff that goes on in terms of human society. So there's some examples like we have water. For example, there's this the Nile River, right? It was a very important river in the ancient times, and it led to the development of a whole of like a really nice civilization right there in Egypt. But today, what's going on? Well, Ethiopia and Egypt and Sudan had this agreement or something that Egypt can actually veto any developments that it can get the required amount of water because the water actually travels from Ethiopia all the way unto Egypt, and Sudan is somewhere in between. So what happened? Ethiopia is building this dam and it doesn't care about the agreement anymore. So it's building a dam, and this is causing an issue because Egypt isn't very happy that there's a dam, because the dam will kind of limit quite a lot of the water that actually comes into Egypt, and that can be problematic for Egypt because it needs the water for its everyday use. Yeah, so that's one example of a water problem, water conflict in a sense. And it's actually 2020. It's not like something that's super old. It's actually a very new conflict. The dam is a very new thing, right? And the next one is oil. Unfortunately, I'm not sure about oil. I didn't find one based on geographical location of oil itself, but I can talk about the oil crisis that is caused by a different reason. So, in Israel, there's the whole issue about the Palestinian state, right? And that kind of caused an issue in the 1970s. And history people will know about the oil crises in the 1970s and 1980s, and that's the oil crisis that I know about. But apparently there's a new one in 2020, but that particular oil crisis is more of an economic thing. So basically, Russia and Saudi Arabia are trying to have a little price war with their oil, and things are going weirdly. So yeah, oil crisis can occur too. It's a bit more geopolitical in nature rather than just geographical. And another conflict can be due to recycling. I will talk about recycling in a future episode in greater detail. But in essence, what's going on is that China used to be taking care of everyone's trash by helping them recycle it. But now China is really upset about it because recycling has environmental consequences sometimes. Like because the people who are in actual charge of the recycling cannot recycle everything, so they just dump the rest of the stuff into the sea or in the rivers and things like that. And China isn't very happy about it. So yeah, it's a geopolitical issue as well, and that has caused certain conflicts recently in the last few years because China decided to ban everyone from sending their trash over there. Basically, that's the issue. And I'll talk about it in greater detail in the recycling episode. Look forward to that. And another thing we can talk about is land itself. The only thing that comes to my mind is this ICJ case. By ICJ, I mean International Court of Justice, which is another history thing. History people will know this. Basically, Burkina Faso and Niger had this issue over a piece of land, but they managed to resolve it amicably in the ICJ. So you can read it on your own because I don't have much time. Just read the information for whatever thing interests you in the stuff that I say. And another thing I can talk about is fishing, which again we can talk about some of the ICJ cases. The most notable one being the UK and Norway case, but I think that's also pretty old. So I'll talk about another thing which is not very ICJ related, but a bit more recent, but also been going on for a very long time, like at least 30 years. So in India, what is underneath India? There is the Sri Lanka. So in between India and Sri Lanka, there's this strait, and you can go fishing there, kind of. So the people from Tamil Nadu, who like the fishers, the fishermen, basically try to get fish from that area, even though the area is supposed to belong to Sri Lanka. But a lot of the Tamil Nadu fishermen go there and try to fish because the fish nearer to India is already kind of run out in a sense. There's not enough fishes there, so they basically keep entering Sri Lanka's fishing territory and fishing from there. And of course, Sri Lanka has the right to send over their navy and tell them, look, you all are like, invading my fishing territory. Don't do it. And then this becomes an issue, and yeah, as usual, is another fishing issue that's been going on for ages. And apart from just the actual conflict itself, there's also the issue of that area just being overfished in general. Apparently, some of the fishermen are fishing so much until they take all the little young fishes out of the water, which kind of disrupts the ecosystem in that area. So yeah, it's a very messy issue. You can read up more about it in the link that I put below. So yeah, the second point in conflicts is another reason would be historical context over the geographical nature of the land. And of course, a lot of this is caused by colonialism. Because, the colonialists do not know much about the land and they just anyhow cut it up. That causes trouble sometimes. So the easiest way to say it is whose land is it? Disputed lands. I do know like the most famous disputed lands includes places like Kashmir and yeah, that's about as much as I remember. And also the South China Seas, I guess. Although there's more of water territory and China being a bit of a bully to the rest of the countries. But okay, that's also kind of land in a different sense. But yeah, let's talk about something else. What about temples? Well, for basically, the pre-Vihya, I know you know how to pronounce that, but the temple in in like the border of Cambodia and Thailand. Yeah, that temple. So it's an ancient Hindu temple, and apparently, when the French invaded Cambodia, they basically just gave the temple to Thailand. And I'm not sure who it's supposed to belong to. And this caused a problem because Cambodia was like, this is my temple, not Thailand's temple. Yeah, so the ICJ ended up ruling it as Cambodia's temple, and that's about it. This is actually a more recent case compared to the other ICJ cases, so you can probably talk about it if you want to. I mean, or if you really want to talk about something even lamer than a temple, I mean, temples are pretty important. So if you want to talk about something really lame, you can talk about that pair of rocks in a lighthouse that, that is nearby Singapore. Yeah, that one. You can talk about that if you want to. I think you know what I'm talking about, right? Okay, never mind. So apart from stuff like that, you can talk about other historical things. Actually, a lot of this is just history. So history and geography go together very well. Another thing that you can talk about is other kinds of colonialist issues. So in Southeast Asia, what I know about is in in some of the countries there are some people who want autonomy, and this is because they were unfairly put in the main country by colonialists. For example, in Southeast Asia, we have Patanis who kind of don't really want to be a part of Thailand. They want to be a part of Malaysia. And we also have Mindanao people who are especially quite, strongly against being part of Philippines because they were unfairly put together with the Philippines by colonialism. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so the final statement I have to say here is that the formation of borders poses problems. Even in the sense of, let's say, the Korean War, like the fact that the US and the USSR decided on a border is the start of the whole thing. If they had never put a border, then maybe Korea would have just been a big country of its own. But the border probably was one of the main reasons why a conflict even started to begin with. So yeah, borders poses problems sometimes. And the last point I'll be talking about for this topic is Google Maps. So I was mentioning that even Google Maps has issues and they're not very good at figuring out the borders of some places. So basically, there's one video in which you know Nicaragua and Colombia, I believe. Basically, the border between them was drawn incorrectly by Google Maps, or at least incorrectly according to one of the countries. Was it Colombia or Costa Rica? Okay, anyway, the point is the border was wrong, and basically the troops of Nicaragua went accidentally into the border because Google Maps didn't tell them that it was actually not belonging to their country, so became an issue. They thought they were invading them and stuff like that. And then after that, Google got into trouble, and then they changed the border on the map. That is quite funny. Anyways, yeah. So even Google Maps can be a cause for conflict. Who knows? And finally, the last topic. I do not want to make this the longest video here. Oh my gosh. So the last topic is trade routes. So trade routes, I think, are both based on physical geography and very much based on human geography. And I think I can always, use Singapore as an example. Singapore was actually looked at by the British because it was in a very favorable spot in amongst all of the countries and stuff like that. And that's how Singapore became an entrepot, and it's still a very significant trading port because it's in a very convenient location in between many trade routes and many countries. It's also a very useful place for having layovers, like basically transferring your plane from one country to another. It's in a very nice, good location. And that has been quite helpful for us because, if we don't have resources, we can instead make our money using the fact that people can pass through us and get money from that instead. Right. So apart from stuff like that, we can also talk about trade conflicts between countries. So we can talk about the trade war between the US and the China that's been happening in the last 2 years. And you can also look at different geopolitical methods by certain countries to try to enamor other countries to join their to join them and support them in the UN or in other against other countries in the sense. So for example, we have seen a lot of it in the Cold War where the US and USSR were trying to get their own blocks to be with them. And we are also seeing it now with China trying to court Burma, Nepal, and other countries in Southeast Asia as well. And they are trying to go against India sometimes by basically trying um, get the favor of countries that are usually associated with India. So yeah, it's a mess as usual. So yeah, that's the last point. Yay, we are done. So I hope you found this episode useful, I guess, because there's a lot of points, even though I told you I had only studied until secondary two. But I think all the points also come from history, so I guess that's why there's a lot of points. Anyways, I hope I managed to finish this video because recording it is one thing, but I need to create the PowerPoint and everything. Oh my. Anyway, so yeah, as you can see, geography is useful in many locations, and it is very much a very easy to go into interdisciplinary areas like geography with history, geography with biology, geography with science. Yeah, it's a very interdisciplinary subject. So I think that's why some people really like geography because it really involves a lot of stuff in it. Yeah, so uh yeah, that's about it. I hope you find this video useful. If you did, please press the like button and subscribe. And with that, I would like to say thank you and bye.